Welcome to Australian Fairy Tales, the podcast. The Australian Fairy Tale Society delights in taking a deep dive through time, culture, and language to explore fairy tales from an Australian perspective to discover what flesh they wear today. Through this podcast, you'll meet some of our fairy tale enthusiasts. G'day, I'm your host, Annie Stewart, and it's my pleasure to welcome Candice Lemon-Scott. That's a mouthful for me. But first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the elders, past, present and emerging, of the land on which I stand, which is that of the Yuggera and Turrbal people in Brisbane. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which our listeners stand, and I extend a welcome to you and those of your country. And where are we welcoming you from today, Candice?
Oh, I'm saying hello from the traditional lands of the Yugambeh people here on the Gold Coast.
Thanks very much. Now, I just wanted to tell people a little bit about you. You're the author of 14 trade published books for children and one for adults, including Jake in Space, Eco Rangers, and Ocean Warriors. With international publications and recognitions from coveted awards to your credit, you're now a University of Newcastle PhD candidate whose creative project and exegesis will focus on non-binary gender representation in Australian middle grade fantasy literature. Could you please tell me the topic for what you're presenting at the conference?
Certainly, thank you. Yes, I'm talking about, because I'm creating a middle grade children's fantasy novel, I'm talking about shapeshifters as beings who can transform, whether being, human or non-human animals, mythical beings, and even inanimate objects. But specifically, I'm talking about therianthropic shapeshifters. So by that, I mean shifters who can change from human form into animal form or non-human animal form. So I think that term first appeared in around 1901 in Asian and European folklore. And it's since been adopted in literature to describe shapeshifters who change from human to non-human animal form.
Oh, I never knew that, and I could have looked it up, I guess, but it was so specific about the paper you're presenting, so I was really curious to find out more behind that. Now, as I've said, you're a published writer. Can you tell us a little bit about the series you've been writing and what inspired you to write them?
Yes, I have a few series out now. The first was Jake in Space, followed by my Eco Rangers series, and then Ocean Warriors is my new one out. So I guess they're all adventures, because that's the kind of stories I loved reading growing up, the adventures and mysteries and magic and the other worlds. And so they're all situated in other worlds or natural worlds. So Jake in Space obviously is outer space. So yes, all my novels and books feature something to do with place and landscape.
And environmental concerns with some of those titles?
Yes, and because I'm so interested in landscape, so Eco Rangers is about a couple of kids who care for Australian wildlife animals and help rescue and rehabilitate and release them back out into the wild. And so because I have such an interest in place and nature, of course, wildlife came into that and concerns around their conservation and future. Yeah.
And have you been out to schools to deliver these books to kids and discuss things with them?
Absolutely, yes. I am with Speakers Inc., which is a speaking agency, and so I go out to schools a lot to talk about animals and looking after them. And so I guess my stories are around kids who are empowered and have agency to do something about it. So we talk a lot about, because I think kids are concerned about our future, but I try and do so in a way that can encourage them to take action and feel like they can't do anything about it and that things are abysmal, but also loving nature and our animals, because I think conservation all comes from that place, and kids generally have a lovely affinity with animals and nature.
Oh, how wonderful. I was wondering how they responded to you, but that seems very positive.
Yeah, it's always a fabulous experience going out and talking about animals with kids.
And so you're doing a PhD. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what drew you to that?
Yes, so I actually applied for my PhD when I was traveling around Australia with my family. We spent about 7 months with our 4-wheel drive and an off-road van, and went to some of kind of the most remote parts of Australia, which I already had an interest in nature and grown up, living out in the bushland and then spending my summer holidays by the seaside and living on the coast pretty much all of my adult life. But going out into those more remote places just made me realise just how diverse our landscape is and how much out there, we could travel for hours at a time and not come across another person or vehicle. And there's just such beauty out there and so many different animals. Anyway, a part of that was we explored some of the cave systems in our travels. I think some of the ones were like, I've got a little list.
You're right. What state were you in with these caves? Just sort of.
So we went to Chilago Caves, Buchan Caves, the caves around the Margaret River area, and Jenolan Caves, even some lesser known ones which you have to navigate through yourself with a torch in Tunnel Creek and places like that in the top end. So I just became so fascinated with this underground landscape that we have. And there were always like different stories that guides would tell us about these cave systems. And one that captured my interest that some people might know came from the Jenolan Caves. So there's a little section that's boarded up with a kind of makeshift door that you can't access. And the story is something around the family deciding that they didn't want the public to go into this part of the cave system, and there were documents destroyed and all kinds of things to keep this area from people accessing anymore. So of course my imaginative mind went to, well, what's behind this door in this part of the cave system that we're not going to enter? And so then I started developing this fantasy idea about shapeshifters who reside inside that cave system. And so this kind of story started to evolve as I applied for my PhD, and that's become the creative project for it.
And so in your topic you're doing for the talks, it's genders included. Is that in your PhD as well?
Yes, it is part of the PhD, because as I was writing this, my eldest child, who's now 17, came out as non-binary. And so as I was writing and exploring my protagonist and looking at gender, I was realizing that my protagonist was non-binary, and I started to have conversations with my teenager about what that means and how we navigate the world and how we would like it to be, because currently it's a very difficult space to navigate because our society is set up in a very gendered way of male, female, especially for children going through school and growing up. And so I was creating a world where it's more normalized and celebrated as, the opportunity that gives to not be constricted by ideas of male or female. So that's where gender comes into the story, and there are other gender diverse characters and other types of diversities represented.
Does your child know you're doing this?
Yeah, so we discussed whether I should be writing this story and if I should be the one to do it, and they came back and said, I would like to see this book produced because there was nothing that represented me growing up. And so it was a traumatic experience understanding non-binary identity, because there wasn't a lot of language around it or space for it, but also there's nothing at that time in literature. So luckily we are starting to see a little bit of that representation, which is fantastic. So it's an exciting time to be writing in that space, but I think we can do more with it and create heroes. And so we talked together, and the decision between us was actually made that I would write this story, because they thought if other kids like them could grow up and have language, it would be a much better process of understanding your own gender identity.
Now, behind you, you might see my Dalesford poster, which is where I used to live, but we were celebrated as the gay capital of country Victoria. But one year I did a talk on, it was sort of stories and talk on, so who was the first gay in the village? And then the next one was on rainbow families and the language of being gay and how we talk about and discuss it, and like you, sort of, you find there's not much there for people navigating, you know, a different world. And on that bookshelf behind me, I could never work out, I found just before I left at my local Sunday market, volumes of the Queensland readers. And they are just, we had the Victorian readers growing up, but everything was kind of a British origin, and the Queensland readers seem even more staid, and it's like nothing Indigenous, nothing in particular. So have you found any stories that are gender inclusive in fairies and folktales and things?
So not so much in their original writings, but I think they have been interpreted at times. I'm looking at some of the stories that have that interpretation, especially around shapeshifter type characters in fairy tales, which is something I'll be talking about a little bit at the conference, how they've been interpreted, or also how they've been retold as more gender inclusive. You know, Little Red Riding Hood's an example I'll be talking about, that, you know, that it's been reimagined in a lot of different ways, including gender inclusivity. But also we have, you know, some authors, children's authors in Australia starting to come out with having a bit more representation, which I'll also touch on a little bit, like Amy Kaufman's Elemental series, a new book out by Samantha Allenbound, Seven Wherewithal Way, which draws on Russian folk tales and fairy tales, and Alison Evans, who wrote Euphoria Kids, which has a lot of magical beings, and they're all kind of gender diverse, which is really great.
So I'm sure if people attend your session, you'll be able to reference all those things if they're interested in following on from that. But what stirred your first interest in fairy tales and myths and legends? Fairy tales in particular, for
yes, yeah, absolutely. So I'm always I grew up reading a lot of those stories, or first being read to fairy tales. I think children still grow up hearing fairy tales and seeing fairy tale movies and so on. But I also read, you know, a lot of other stories like Alice in Wonderland, Wizard of Oz, Narnia Chronicles, and even books like Playing Beatty Bow, Secret Garden, Wind in the Willows. So all those stories fascinated me. I was always an avid reader ever since I was very young. So I've always loved stories that are fairy tales or draw on fairy tale creatures and magic and those kind of ideas. So and as I was creating, you know, starting my creative project around these shapeshifter characters, of course, it harks back to a lot of those magical creatures that we know and love from fairy tales, and how we can rewrite them in different ways.
What's your cultural background? Are you just wondering if those fairy tales inspired you?
Yeah, so I just I grew up in Victoria myself. So I was born and raised here, and my parents were born and raised in Australia as well, but our history goes well back to more Irish, Scottish and English ancestry. So I don't really have a lot of kind of connection to other cultures in that regard, but definitely grew up with those stories around me.
It's such a rich vein, some of those old Celtic stories. Did you start investigating any traditional First Nation stories, or did you feel...
I haven't really, because I feel like that's a cultural appropriation.
No.
Yeah, so I'm fascinated. Like when we travelled Australia, we heard a lot of the wonderful Dreamtime stories and saw a lot of cave paintings and heard a lot about that. And I think that's a really fascinating culture as well. So I like to draw on Australian landscape. It's a little bit of a tricky balance, isn't it? Because you don't want to erase that kind of history, but also not appropriate it either. So that's something I'll consider in my writing.
It does always occur to me from a very early age, as a Catholic schoolgirl, I heard biblical stories about another land, and, you know, the Greek myths and legends of the stars, and nothing really about, you know, our own landscape. So
Yes, that's right. And traveling around, I mean, I did realise how much we don't know about our own history and culture and Indigenous cultures. So hopefully that's changing in schools now. But yes, I was saying raised in Catholic school with the biblical stories and Greek myths and so on as well. So yes, that's what we have greater knowledge of than our own country's history.
I know.
Cultural stories.
I have an Indigenous star chart and it's so well worn, but like you, I don't feel they're my stories to tell, but I share them and, you know, with interest, acknowledging where they're from. Was there a type of fairy tale? It was mostly the shapeshifters that got your interest.
Yes, I'm very interested. I loved, like I draw a little bit on things like Beauty and the Beast and the Little Mermaid and the Frog Prince, you know, that have those shapeshifter characters in them. And just the magic, like there are fairies and so on in my story, because I love those kind of ideas drawn from fairy tales and other folk tales.
Everybody adapts and interprets some of these old fairy tales. What's your take on some of the Disney, you know, movies? For
well,
instance,
it's
The Little
interesting.
Mermaid,
I mean,
where the important thing about the story is walking on feet like knives, you know, whereas...
Yeah, I know. And it's interesting to see those Disney stories, and I'm looking forward to see there's, you know, new ones coming out all the time, but also different interpretations like Maleficent and, you know, those kind of villainous heroes and, you know, empowered heroes, and all different ways of interpreting them in modern ways, which is interesting, as well as the retellings of more traditional ones they've done, like Cinderella and those kind of stories. So, and even stage shows, the Beauty and the Beast stage shows and things like that. So they capture our imagination in traditional and new ways, I think, fairy tales. And I found that with my children as well, watching these different movies and seeing the shows.
There's definitely more strong female characters, isn't there, now in a lot of them? Frozen and Moana, and I have two granddaughters up here, so I've sort of been following all those.
Yeah, so we've been loving the Frozen, and we went and saw that stage show up at QPAC, which was just beautiful.
We saw it when they were in Sydney. They've now moved up here, and my granddaughter was on her phone. She said, "Is this a movie? Is this TV? What is this kind of this live show we're seeing?" So she enjoyed it. So this sounds so fascinating, you know, what you'll be presenting at the conference. So it's a talk, is it, you're doing?
Yes, I'm doing a talk. So talking a little bit about the creative work and also what inspired it, and theoranthropic shapeshifters in regard to that, and how we reimagine them. So, yeah.
So from what I understood, you're doing a PhD, but you're also creating a story that'll be a demonstration of what you found. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's a bit of a combination of a creative project, which is the middle grade fantasy novel, and then an exegesis, which explores those ideas that I'm talking about, examining through the storytelling.
Well, that's a great idea. Is anyone interested, do you think, to follow it up, publish it, or you're hoping?
Yes, I hope so.
Excellent. So this October, our annual conference will consider the theme Australian fairy tales, flesh or fossil. What interested you most about the theme, and why did you apply to be part of it?
I was so interested in the theme. I presented on a panel at Comic-Con, and Catherine and June were there, and we were talking about gender inclusivity and other kind of inclusivity as fairy tales are reimagined, and where they fit in today's storytelling. And so I said, oh, maybe, you know, my topic would be of interest, and we started talking around that, and I submitted to it. I think the topic around fossil or flesh is a really fascinating one, because I think fairy tales, you know, are both. So, you know, a fossil to me is, you know, especially seeing fossils out in my travels, it's, you know, this preserved part of history. So where we kind of understand our history and where we came from. So it's not to be forgotten, I don't think. I don't think we should forget traditional fairy tales, because there's a lot to learn about them and how we've evolved as humans. But at the same time, in reimagining them, I think we're adding kind of new flesh to those old bones. So, in children's fantasy novels, we're always drawing on ideas from fairy tales and folklore and myths and legends. That's part of magic in stories that are fantasy based. But I think we can also include those new ways and new modern ways of thinking. And also, I think for the future, we can see how we'd like the world to be transformed through fantasy and fairy tale to empower children.
So some of your stories are set in the future?
Some of them are, yes. So I mean, Jake in Space was set in the future, obviously, where kids can travel through the solar system, and Ocean Warriors as well is set in a future world where a lot of species are extinct but are being restored. So yes, yeah, the future interests me as well.
What about the learning lessons of fairy tales? Is that resonated with you? Is there any you read and think that had a strong message? Or
yeah, it's interesting, the moralistic side of the fairy tale. I think we kind of lose, we don't hark back to that now because we don't want to be didactic in the way we speak to children. However, story is always about personal growth and change of our characters. So I think there is something to think about there as well.
And as you mentioned earlier on, landscape is really important to you. So how do you know where you're going to set your novels or your fairy tales or work you're doing?
Yes, well, definitely this one I'm writing at the moment for the PhD is set in a cave system. So I am drawing on a lot from those caves that I went to, and the crystal and rock formations and things like that I found through exploring these caves. And also the world just above, which there were some quite interesting worlds that kind of reminded me of fairy tales, especially out at the Jenolan caves. There's little bridges and turquoise water and things like that all kind of inform the story and are drawn into the story as well.
So you did hear some Indigenous stories about the caves in your travels, did you say?
Yeah, there were a few, because sometimes we were lucky enough to have Indigenous guides, especially out at Chilago, which is fabulous to see. So we did hear some of those stories as well, which was wonderful.
Where's Chilago, sorry?
It's our kind of traveling up through past Queensland, but in more west. So yeah, it's not a very well known, but it's a very unusual landscape. Even above ground is very rocky, and as well as underground there's a lot of cave systems, so it's well worth a visit.
How did your children respond to that adventure?
Oh, they were fascinated. I mean, my eldest wants to become a geologist, so that was part of the motivation for exploring these cave systems. And yeah, so they enjoyed that side of it, and hearing those stories as well, and seeing some of those cave paintings and learning about the geology of the caves and how they formed.
Well, I agree to the women you met at Comic-Con that this seems to be a place for you in this conference. Mm-hmm. And I think people will be really interested in coming along to have a look. So your topic is the reinvention of therianthropic shapeshifters. Therianthropic. I should have.
There's a mouthful for you.
before I came to see. It's been really fascinating talking to you, and I look forward to meeting you at the conference. So thank you very much for talking with me. I'm your podcast host, Annie Stewart, and I've been talking to Candice Lemon-Scott. All fairy tale enthusiasts are welcome to attend a fairy tale ring, either online or in the state which you live, and or to attend the Brisbane conference on October the 1st to the 2nd, 2022. There we'll explore the question of Australian fairy tales, flesh or fossil. To learn more, visit australianfairytalesociety.org, or our social media tag is @AustFairyTales. Thank you so much for talking with me today, and I look forward to meeting you at the conference.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks so much for chatting with me. I'm really looking forward to the conference.